Okay, so guided tour of the Trumpeter IS3 modified for infrared remote control. So here we have the main circuit board, which contains the remote control electronics. I've added connectors for the two track motors and for the turret motor, track motors and turret motor. Here are the two track motors modified from gearboxes available on eBay, cut down, less reduction, bigger motors. Not much of the original gearbox left really, but there is some of it left. The important thing, a worm reduction followed by a spur gear reduction. We've got a battery. You see it's not the sort of battery used in the regular infrared remote control tanks. It's the type used in a electrically powered aircraft. Charging socket from the original infrared remote control tank, and that's pretty much it. The real challenge is fitting it all in. So you can see the battery is sort of wedged in under the motors. The motors are held in place by a brass block which is down inside here. Circuit board's held in place by a screw. Battery's kind of just wedged there, as I say. Socket is glued in. The board's also retained by this piece of lead which I've attached to the body with glue and bent over, and it's being lead, you can bend it easily, and it makes quite a good way of holding the board down. One of the challenges, of course, is fitting everything in such a way that when you put the body together it doesn't stop it from closing up, and that is probably the most difficult thing on these 1/72 tanks. Let's show a guided tour of the upper hull of the tank. IS3 Trumpeter modified for remote control. The original turret drive, changed fixing arrangements. I'll take it apart and show you more about that later. We've got two brass pillars here, which is something I have around the place in large quantities, so I use them for wherever I can. They're 12 BA tapped pillars. They're really useful, just about the right dimensions, about 20mm long, designed for different application, but works well for holding tank bodies together. I added a slab of lead here. I felt the performance of the thing will be better with a bit of weight. Not sure I'm right about that, but it's in there for the moment. Two connectors. This one for the turret actuator, turret drive, the main thing you can see here. And this is the connection, the circuit board in the turret, which has got 5 wires into one of these miniature JS3 type connectors, which is original on the infrared remote control tank by VSX. So I'm going to show you how the turret's assembled. It's quite a complicated assembly here. A couple of 12 BA screws. So you've got those two nuts off, and then the actual actuator just lifts off. I've got washers fitted there so that it kind of makes up with the original hole size, which is for slightly bigger screws. And you can see the ring gear there, which is one of the most difficult to replicate parts on these tanks, and I've only ever obtained ring gears from other model tanks with actuated turrets. You can see I've got a couple of captive 12 BA screws here, which are attached to the body, screwed through with washers and nuts, and that's so I can get the assembly order of the turret to allow me to have screws holding the turret together. You'll see in a minute. So the turret just is attached by one central screw, as you might expect, since it's a rotating item. That's this one here. That's a countersunk M2 screw. You'll see why that is in a minute. So there we are. The turret is now free. Now you see, if you look at the area where the turret mounts, I've actually grafted in part of the original remote control tank, which I believe in the colour of this was a Sherman, VSX Sherman, and I think that's really absolutely necessary, but I just found it easier to start with something that I knew worked and just replicate what had been done before. I ended up changing quite a bit. You can see I made a new hole here for the gear. The original position of the gear in this location here wasn't right for fitting the actuator inside the tank, so I ended up making a lot of changes. Maybe didn't need to start with the original, but that's how I've done it. So now we have the turret. See the again, I've grafted a part of the original tank in here. The sort of more olive coloured part is the original parts of the original Sherman tank. I've attached the two parts of the trumpeter kit together using some 12BA screws. Now these locations here were original locations of pegs, which are locating pegs, and you're supposed to glue the turret together, of course, in plastic kit. Now I just got rid of the pegs and drilled some countersunk holes. I just found that the holes in the upper part of the turret were just the right size of kind of self-tapping in the 12BA, and you have to be quite delicate and gentle with that, otherwise you'd strip it, but it works pretty well. So I'll just take that apart and show you inside. Okay, so I've removed those 3 screws, and now just got to get this thing apart without hopefully causing too much damage. There it is. The top part, you can see those are the 3 locations for the screws. They're just the original pin locations. The top's pretty standard apart from that, with one exception. Not immediately obvious from looking at this. I had a lot of problem getting the infrared pickup, which is in this top board here. This is the this thing here is the infrared pickup device, which receives commands from the sender, the control unit, and also it's how you hit the tank when you're using the battle system. It's the same detector for that. As you can see, I think quite clearly I've cut away the hatch there and had to glue it back in and made a right old mess there, but I hopefully got away with it reasonably well. It's definitely not 100% if you look at the top, but you'll see if you look carefully there's a little piece of clear plastic rod in here. It's just a very simple short length of rod with a fairly polished off end on both ends, and that just goes through and shows on the inside there. And I found that actually that was enough, as long as it was lined up pretty well with the sensor device, to allow the signals to be received. Surprisingly small, and I'm planning to do that for other tanks that I modify in future, because it's barely noticeable if you look at it. It's actually appropriate enough going through what would be the viewing port on the hatch there. I'm not quite sure whose hatch that is, but it's probably the driver's hatch. Sorry, probably the commander's hatch. Anyhow, let's put that to the side and show what's inside the turret. Now the turret, see, has got a small circuit board in there. This has got, basically it's got the receiver for the infrared I mentioned before, and it's also got a, not quite so obviously here, but there is a LED here. It's an infrared LED, which is the firing device when using the battle system. And you see I've lined it up through the what I believe is the machine gun hole on the side of the mantlet there, and it doesn't work too well, but it does work at some level. I'm not primarily interested in the battle system, so it's okay for me. This LED here is the kind of LED that shows that you're on, and it also flashes when you've been hit and stuff. I didn't really want that visible. It's hardly realistic, but yeah, it's there anyhow. And you can just about see it through the plastic in a dark room. So just to take this far a bit further, the gun and PCB come off. Good old blue tack there is just retaining the thing a little bit. It's mainly retained by the mantlet. Well, you see the ring gear dropped out. That's actually a separate part, and that's if you look at the inside of that assembly there, you can see that's a kind of torque limiting system where these things, little teeth on the outside, engage with the teeth on the inside of the plastic moulding there. That's one of the reasons to retain that original part, at least in the turret, so that if you force the turret around by hand, it doesn't wreck your mechanism, it just clicks round. You can see it's not very obvious, but right in the middle here you've got an M2 what are those things called? Anyway, it's one of these thread lock type nuts, where there's a piece of nylon at the top, and it's called a nylock, I think, isn't it? Anyhow, one of those sort of things. And the idea of that, of course, is that you've got no other way of locking off that screw. You've got the screw which comes up from the base of the tank through the turret hole, and that goes into that. And if you didn't have a way of locking it, it just works loose as the turret rotates. So I found that a pretty good way. Now, what I wanted to end up with was a system where I could secure the turret together with screws, which I've done using those two holes there, and then secure the turret to the tank using screws, rather than the system which used on some of the standard production models, where they're kind of little plastic clips, and it's a bit of hit and miss, and the things tend to push apart, and I wasn't satisfied with that. So slightly more detailed look at the mechanism. You can see there's a brass block in here, and I've attached the two gearboxes to this brass block, and the block itself is attached into the tank using a single M12 screw. In fact, for a long time I didn't, a 12BA screw, didn't have any fixing at all, and it worked fine, but I felt guilty about it, so I put a fixing in there. So there's two axles, one through each gearbox going through. There are brass top hat bearings on the outer part of the bearing here, so the thing actually runs on a brass bearing. On the weight of the model goes onto a brass bearing inside here. Now the wheels, now these are quite delicate on the Trumpeter IS3, although they're certainly worse. I mean, I've been playing with the Vesta IS2, and that's even worse. But as long as you're careful, you can use original parts. Now I've had to replace quite a lot of the swinging arms because I managed to break them off during the development of the model. And you see, if you look carefully, there's now the swinging arms are a mixture of arms from different kits, but they're all IS3 arms, just some of them from a Rodin kit rather than from the original kit. Of course, my policy on these sort of things, if you're going to make an infrared remote control version of a model like this, you really need to have two kits to go at, so that you can have some spare parts. And what I've done is I drilled holes in right through the pivot point of the wheels. Now I've used these pins, as you can see, this pin through each one for the road wheels. Now these are Dura's flathead pins, quite a specialised item, but they're available on eBay. The advantage of those over dressmakers pins is they're softer, easier to work with. They've got a larger, flatter, thinner head, and you have to select them quite carefully because they're not precise machined item, but they if you select them carefully you can find good flat ones. These sort of return track wheels are pivoting on 12BA screws, and actually they're only 14BA screws. Sorry, they're 14BA screws, which are about the same size as a pin, about 0.6 or 8 millimeters diameter. Sorry, I have tried 14BA screws in all of these positions, but in the end I think the pins are slightly better. I think both can make it work. It's just cosmetic, really. The cosmetic appearance of the pins looks a little bit more like the wheels. So the tracks are not the original tracks. Of course, if you're familiar with this kit, you'll know that they are rigid tracks, but the track is in fact from a KV1 by Trumpeter, which is a very similar chassis. It's not quite the same. You have to shorten the tracks slightly, but the tracks themselves, the same width, the same design, they're indistinguishable. And you can see the join here, which is about the only thing of any great interest, which is done using super glue. I've overlapped one set of tracks, clamped it together really hard using clamping tweezers, and after a fair amount of repeat trial and error, managed to get it to work well. These tracks have been running on this tank now without any repair for quite some months. I don't run the tank very often, but it has had some use. Okay, so a sort of minimal demo of this tank with its infrared remote control. Obviously you have reverse and forward drive. You can rotate on the tracks. and you've got the turret. Turret has a slightly annoying feature, which is a timeout. That's a product of the ESX remote control. Interestingly, the recently produced bantamweight tanks from Toro or IMEX or Waltersons, depending on who you think they're from, they don't have that feature. Apart from that, they have exactly the same controls. So we'll do more comprehensive demonstration on the battlefield. Okay, so more comprehensive demonstration. As I say, I'm not a brilliant driver. I don't know how difficult it was for real tank drivers, but the gun itself is a significant problem when you're trying to manoeuvre in constrained situations. So I'm not going at full speed here, just trying to give some idea of the manoeuvrability and the controllability. That is full speed. It's not particularly quick. That's quite intentional. I did some calculations on scale speeds. Wasn't sure that the scale speeds were really what you want to see on a relatively small battlefield model, so I actually made it slower than that. But it's at this sort of speed it's reasonably controllable, and although the motion is still pretty jerky, I don't think it's too bad.